Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We are going to look at two completely opposite models built to address human addiction, and we're going to analyze them strictly through the fascinating lens of complex system design. We're looking at the federal drug enforcement model, what's often called the war on drugs, and comparing it directly to the decentralized mutual aid architecture of Alcoholics Anonymous. These two frameworks reveal absolutely totally opposed philosophies of institutional architecture. And honestly, comparing them side by side teaches us some incredible lessons about why systems either totally fail or massively flourish.
So let's dive into this by asking the ultimate system design question. How exactly do you solve a problem that adapts every single time you try to fix it? Because human addiction and the illicit drug markets that surround it, well, they aren't just your standard legal or medical issues. They represent what system theorists actually call a wicked problem. It's a phenomenon that is deeply persistent, totally multidimensional, and it constantly morphs in response to whatever interventions we try to apply to it.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Two approaches to addiction. 2. The command and control model. 3. The decentralized mutual network. 4. The physics of feedback loops. 5. Measuring the societal outcomes. And 6. Lessons in system design.
Section 1. Two approaches to addiction, framing the wicked problem. Here's the absolute crucial thing you've got to understand right off the bat. Illicit markets and human addictions are complex adaptive systems. In a complex adaptive system, you have nonlinear interactions. Basically, it's not just a simple equation where X always perfectly equals Y. The actors inside the system are constantly adapting to their environment. This means that these networks respond to our actions with consequences that are rarely proportional and almost never strictly predictable. The core issue here is that many of our institutions are built on linear thinking. They assume that just pulling a big lever at the top will neatly fix the problem down at the bottom.
Section 2. The command and control model, the war on drugs.
Let's look at the federal drug enforcement model. It was built exactly as a top-down command and control machine. It leans heavily on punitive mechanisms designed to basically eradicate both supply and demand through state-sanctioned force. The foundational doctrine here relies on the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. This act uses a super-rigid taxonomy to categorize substances into 5 distinct schedules, basically ranking them based on medical use and abuse potential. Now, the architecture here assumes that if you categorize a substance, criminalize its use, and apply sustained law enforcement pressure, it will naturally yield a proportional reduction in drug use. From a systems perspective, this is what we call open-loop or strictly linear operational thinking.
But applying rigid, linear metrics to complex human behavior? Well, that eventually escalated, big time. In the 1980s, the system explicitly shifted to a heavy prison model. For example, mandatory minimums engineered this massive 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between pharmacologically identical substances. 5 grams of crack cocaine suddenly carried the same weight as 500 grams of powder cocaine. It was a clear attempt to engineer social outcomes through blunt, overwhelming force. And, as we'll see, it laid the groundwork for absolutely devastating systemic disparities down the line.
And honestly, this sets up the perfect pivot to our second model. We're contrasting the really rigid hierarchy and linear logic of the war on drugs with the organic, peer-to-peer architecture of our next subject, a system that relies entirely on radical inclusivity and cybernetic loops.
Section 3. The decentralized mutual network, the 12 traditions.
Let's pivot over to System B. This was adopted by Alcoholics Anonymous back in 1950, and it is a literal masterclass in organizational design. Rather than a top-down hierarchy, the 12 traditions act as a totally decentralized operating system. It uses these incredibly smart rules to insulate itself from corruption. Take radical inclusivity, for example. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. Zero financial barrier to entry. Plus, every single group has distributed autonomy, meaning they can adapt to their local cultures instantly. And the traditions actually actively enforce structural anarchy. They explicitly forbid hierarchical management. It is a brilliant, anti-fragile, bottom-up design.
Section 4. The physics of feedback loops, system dynamics in action.
So, to really grasp why one of these systems struggles so profoundly while the other scales globally, we have to look under the hood, at the invisible physics of feedback loops. The command and control model mathematically generates runaway positive feedback loops. That means changes are amplified, driving the whole system further away from equilibrium. Think about it. When the state intervenes by eradicating crops, the drug supply drops, and naturally, street prices surge. But that inflated price acts as a massive economic incentive. It triggers a reinforcing loop that actually accelerates the creation of brand new drug cartels rushing in to capture that newly profitable market. Aggressive eradication literally dynamically incentivizes the expansion of the illicit market itself.
And this dynamic causes a system-induced market evolution known as the iron law of prohibition. It's fascinating. The intense logistical pressures of smuggling under heavy law enforcement actually favor creating ultra-compact, highly potent substances. It's the exact same dynamic that pushed the market from bulky beer to potent distilled spirits during alcohol prohibition. Today, it completely explains the shift from plant-based substances to deadly ultra-concentrated synthetic analogs like fentanyl, which are engineered specifically to bypass the system's enforcement network.
Now flip that over to the mutual aid network. It runs entirely on negative balancing feedback loops. Back in 1971, the eminent systems theorist Gregory Bateson made this brilliant observation. He said that addiction itself is a positive runaway loop of an individual trying to constantly assert willpower over a complex dependency. He noted the absolute genius of AA is how the moment of total surrender abandons that illusion of individual control. It seamlessly integrates a person into a stabilizing, self-correcting community network. The traditions act like regulatory governors on an engine. If a group strays from its core purpose, members lose sobriety, which is an immediate, undeniable negative feedback signal that forces the group to either self-correct or dissolve entirely.
Section 5. Measuring the societal outcomes. The scorecard.
Okay, time for the scorecard. Let's measure the real-world impact of these two approaches. Over the past 5 decades, the rigid application of institutional design in the drug enforcement model has fueled massive, unprecedented carceral growth. Since 1972, the U.S. incarcerated population increased 5-fold, but without any comparable decrease in drug use. Today, if you look at the federal prison population, nearly half, 45%, are incarcerated specifically for drug-related offenses.
And as a direct, systemic output of this flawed top-down design, profound racial disparities emerged. Because complex human behavioral problems were abstracted into rigid matrices and mandatory minimums, marginalized groups ended up bearing the brunt of the enforcement. The empirical data is stark. Black Americans are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses compared to white Americans, despite having essentially equal substance usage rates across the board.
Furthermore, maintaining this highly centralized enforcement machine demands an astronomical financial burden. We're talking about 44 different federal agencies and hundreds of thousands of workers. The current estimated cost to society? It exceeds $34 billion every single year.
Now contrast that $34 billion with the financial burden of the 12 Traditions network on society. Its cost? Exactly $0. Tradition 7 actually mandates complete financial self-sufficiency. They decline all outside contributions, all grants, and all government assistance. It manages an immense, incredibly complex public health crisis completely free of charge to the taxpayer. And by completely eliminating those gatekeepers and distributing power to the edges, this anti-fragile organism has achieved unparalleled global scale. Think about this. It is operational right now in 180 countries, translated into over 100 languages, and comprises 123,000 autonomous groups, supporting over 2 million active members. It is successfully managing a massive behavioral crisis without an ounce of state coercion, bureaucracy, or tax dollars.
Section 6. Lessons in System Design. What works for complex behaviors.
All right, as we wrap this explainer up, what does this objective comparison really teach us? The data pretty unequivocally shows that peer-to-peer, context-sensitive networks are vastly superior to top-down abstraction when you're dealing with wicked problems. In fact, the open-source, totally adaptable nature of the 12 Traditions allowed the exact same framework to be ported seamlessly for entirely different dependencies. It naturally gave rise to massive networks like Narcotics Anonymous and Dual Recovery Anonymous. And they did it all without ever needing centralized permission or a single legislative act.
And the secret sauce to surviving all of that growth without getting corrupted? It comes down to the ultimate cybernetic constraint, subordinating the human ego. By mandating strict anonymity at the public level, the system ensures that no single individual can leverage their status for prestige or power. It absolutely ensures that the primary mission remains eternally uncorrupted by personal ambition or the very human lure of centralized authority. So stepping back from addiction entirely for a second, I want to leave you with this final thought. When our rigid top-down hierarchies fail to solve complex adaptive problems, what alternative architectures are out there?
How else could we use these proven principles, things like structural anarchy, radical inclusivity, and mutual aid, to completely redesign the failing systems in our own communities? The blueprint is right there in front of us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the systems around you.